Fossil graveyards are found all over the world. I mean, there are thousands of these. Huge piles of things died, or got buried at least, in one place. Doesn't tell us where they died, we just know where they ended up getting buried. Here's a picture showing 4 dinosaurs, or small hoofed mammals, I'm sorry, not dinosaurs, 4 of them in Nebraska that were found in the swimming position. They're all fossilized, but they were swimming. Probably in water getting muddier and muddier, and they ended up getting buried, drowning in that position, and covered and fossilized. It doesn't take long for things to fossilize. There's a place in Africa called the Karoo Formation. Estimates are there are 800,000 million. That's 800 billion vertebrate animals buried in this one big formation across Africa. What happened? Well, there was a flood. Back in 1878, they found in a coal mine in Belgium, iguanodon skeletons running through 100 feet vertically of rock. All these iguanodon skeletons, at least 100 feet of rock deposited very quickly, obviously. Up in northern Canada, there's a place called Ellis Island. There on Ellesmere Island, there are no trees at all, none, yet they find petrified redwood stumps up there. There are certainly no redwood trees growing up there in northern Canada, okay? There are only a few select locations where they grow along the California coast and up into Oregon a little bit. And it doesn't take long for things to petrify, not at all. Things can petrify very quickly. We've got some examples here on the table of things that petrified very quickly. I'll show you those in a second. Here's a picture of a petrified water wheel. Here's petrified firewood. It was chopped on before it got petrified. You can go to Southern Forest World Museum in Georgia, Waycross, Georgia. There's a mummified dog stuck inside a tree. Some people say it's petrified. I don't know if it's mummified. I've not been there yet. But anyway, how can a dog get mummified just in probably a few years? Chased a coon up the tree, got stuck. They named it Stucky, of course. That's the name for the dog. They had a contest to name it, and so they called it Stucky. They cut the tree down for firewood. There's a dog inside. Here's a petrified cowboy boot with the cowboy's legs still in it. The boot was made in the 1950s. Got his leg shot off or torn off or who knows what, but there's his leg petrified. Here's a petrified fish giving birth. A petrified hammer was found from a Marine barracks from World War II. Petrified hammer. Petrified hat found in New Zealand. Here's a kid sent me this right here on the table, a petrified crayon found in Arizona. I mean, the crayon is turned to stone. We have right here a petrified pickle. It's in our museum. Well, it's here tonight, but a guy sent me this and the jar with it. The jar is still in our museum. He said, Brother Hovind, I found this old house in Montana. The roof was gone. The house had been empty at least 30 years. But we were digging around through what's left of this house and found the pantry. And there were pickle jars in there, but the lid to one of the jars rusted, and the pickle inside turned to stone. Would you like it for your museum? I said, well, yeah, of course. One kid wrote me a letter. Here's the letter right here. He said, Brother Hovind, I was 8 years old doing a science experiment. I put a bunch of acorns in a bucket of water to see if they would sprout. And I forgot about them. A year later, my mom saw the bucket on the back porch. She said, get rid of that bucket and all that junk out there. He said, the acorns had turned to stone in 1 year. I have right here a baggie of petrified acorns. It doesn't take long, folks. Don't let them tell you it takes millions of years for things to petrify. It's not true. A guy sent me a picture of a petrified pin cushion. The pin cushion, you can see the pins had rusted off, except where you can see the rust marks where the pins had been stuck in there. Petrified pin cushion. They dug up a grave in Tennessee several years ago. They found the body of the person inside the grave had petrified, turned to stone. The doctor died and they buried him. 14 years later, his wife died. This is back in 1881. They dug a hole to bury Grandma, and water went into the hole. And they thought, oh, we don't want to bury Grandma in the water, so they buried her someplace else. Then the kids got worried about Grandpa in that moving water. It hit an underground spring, apparently. So they dug up Grandpa. He'd been in the ground 14 years. And the article says, the occupant of the coffin had been turned to stone, presumably as a result of the a continual flow of water. It said the arms had rotted off, but the rest of the body had turned to stone, petrified. A guy found a petrified man in Montana. He took it 5'8". The guy carried it around as a museum curiosity for years in carnivals and fairs and stuff. Petrified body of a man found on the beach in Montana, in a beach of a river. In Sao Paulo, Brazil, a lady went into the hospital. She said, my side's been hurting. The lady was 62 years old. They x-rayed her and found a petrified fetus, a baby, inside. She had been pregnant. The baby almost came to term and died, apparently, and turned to stone inside her body. 62-year-old lady with a petrified baby inside. Here's the article. You can read it for yourself. I met a guy in Maryland who said he worked at a hospital, Brian Lackey, who lives in Washington, but There's his phone number. He was in Maryland. He said they brought a lady in there and took out a petrified fetus out of her body. The baby's in the museum now, or in a medical hospital up there. Petrified fetus. Here's petrified sacks of flour found in Arkansas. A flour mill flooded. The flour turned to stone. The sacks of flour were buried in water and mud and turned to rock. There's our petrified pickle right there. You can see the jar it was found in. Come by our museum at Dinosaur Adventureland and see all this. So it's true there are layers to the earth. It's also true they can form very quickly. I think the flood's the best explanation for this. Skeptics will say, wait a minute, why are all dinosaur bones found in the same layer? First of all, they're not, okay? But it is true there is a little bit of sorting to the fossils, okay? And I think there's a better explanation for that than evolution. They're only told in school this is showing an evolutionary pattern. This is pure baloney in my totally unbiased opinion. First place, the fossils are not sorted clearly like the textbook says. David Ropp said, one of the ironies of the evolution-creation debate is the creationists have accepted the mistaken notion that the fossil record shows a detailed and orderly progression. And they've gone to great lengths to accommodate this fact in their flood geology. There isn't an orderly progression. If there is any progression at all, there's a better explanation called the flood. I think fossils are separated by their density, and we'll cover that in a minute. But there is no geologic column. We covered that in video number 4. They date the rocks by the fossils, date the fossils by the rocks. It's all based on circular reasoning. Moving water and liquefaction are much better explanations for the sorting in the fossil record. There are several things that happen with high-velocity water in a flood moving around, swirling around the world. You get liquefaction, you get, of course, abrasion and simple erosion, and you get hydraulic plucking. Rapidly moving water creates a vacuum, and it sucks rocks right off the side. The big dam, the dam in Arizona, the Glen Canyon Dam in Arizona, they had water going through the pipes it was having flood season, getting rid of as much water as they could, and it started going too fast. And they saw it turn red as it came out the side. They said, oh, shut it down. It's eroding the sides of the dam. Within, I think, 20 seconds it took from the time that they got the message to shut the water down, scuba divers went down there, and during that, I think, 20 seconds, it had eroded an area in the side of the mountain the size of a basketball court, about 4 feet deep. Sucked it right off the side. Rapidly moving water dissolves whatever it's moving against. A process called hydraulic plucking. There's another phenomenon called liquefaction. If you go stand out on the beach, walk out into the surf where the water's about knee deep, just stand there, don't move. Every time the waves come by, the high part of the wave is heavier than the low part. There's more water. The high part is going to press the sand down. As the low part comes past you, it's going to relieve the pressure. And if you're down there with goggles looking at it, you can see the sand hopping up off the bottom. Just stand there and don't move. Within about 5 minutes, you'll be about that deep, your feet covered up in sand. And you didn't move. What's happening is the pressing and relieving of the pressure is causing a phenomenon called liquefaction. This is automatically going to sort things. Now, during the flood, you would get enormous liquefaction because just the tides. As the Earth turns under the moon, if the Earth is covered with water, the tides are still going to work during the flood, but now there's no continents to stop them. Today, the tide just gets going and then it bumps into something like South America, so, all the energy is taken out. But during the flood, you wouldn't have that. Computer models tell us that if the Earth were covered with water, smoothed out and covered with water, the tides would change 200 feet every 6 hours and 25 minutes. Well, today here in Florida, they change, 16 inches. We don't get much tide here. I've been up to the Bay of Fundy in northern Canada where the tide changes up to 100 feet. It's the record, 102 feet. Anchorage, Alaska has the second highest tide in North America, 30-foot tidal change. You can see the water come rushing up and then 6 hours later start rushing back down. So you'd get a 200-foot tidal change during the flood. This 200 feet of water would do enormous things to the surface underneath called liquefaction. It would sort things. Actually, a guy took an aquarium, big aquarium one time, and he put a big hot water bottle in the bottom and poked it full of thousands of holes. And he hooked a hose up to it. Then he dumped into the aquarium dirt, rocks, gravel, sand, mud, dead fish, dead amphibians, dead reptiles, mixed them all up in a cement mixer and dumped them in. Turned the hose on. Water came out through the bottom and bubbled up through this aquarium to fill up the aquarium. Of course, as it fills up the aquarium, it's going to lift the particles and then drop them again, and the denser ones drop a little faster every time. Within just a few hours of filling this aquarium, it sorted all the animals, and it put the fish at the bottom, amphibians next, reptiles next, birds on top. Automatically sorted them. Now, it would look like they got buried in that order, but no, they got sorted in that order by liquefaction. Plus, if huge areas of sand are buried under there, if something is lighter and it's buried by a heavier, denser layer on top, you can get what's called a sand plume. All of a sudden, things are moving around. Pretty soon, bloop, it bubbles to the top. And big chunks of lighter material like sand would bubble out to the top. That's probably what caused Ayers Rock in Australia. It's a giant sand plume, badly eroded today. And you can see if you get up close to it, there are millions of little tiny holes in it. It's probably a big, what's called a sand plume, where the sand just bubbled up through the heavier material on top of it. Liquefaction also causes the ground to turn like jelly. During earthquakes, like here's these buildings in Japan, during the earthquake, the ground shakes, all the water comes to the top, and the buildings just sink in. If animals are sorted at all, it's probably based on habitat. Evolutionists would say, Hovind, don't you know clams are found at the bottom of the geologic column? I said, well, first, they're not always found at the bottom, but if they are found at the bottom, generally, that's probably because that's where they live. Logic would tell us they'd be the first ones buried, right? Animals might be sorted based on habitat. They might be sorted based on intelligence. You know, as far as anybody can figure out, clams are not too smart. They might be sorted based on mobility. Did you know clams can't run very fast? They might be sorted based on body density. Did you know clams are a little heavier than bird feathers? And birds are the last ones to drown in a flood. So if birds are found on top of the geologic column, that doesn't prove they evolved last, it proves they drowned last. Or they ended up floating to the top when they did drown. So the Bible says the high hills were covered. The earth was totally covered by a flood. 15 cubits, that's about 22 feet, over the mountains. Boy, God thinks of everything. That ark was 45 cubits, or 30 cubits high, 45 feet. So there was, if it had 50% underwater, which is pretty heavy for a boat, still couldn't scrape bottom on any mountains. They were perfectly safe in there. God thought of everything. So the skeptics say, where'd all the water go? Oh, it's still here. The Bible says in Genesis chapter 8, the water's assuaged. That means to drop down, to sink down. Now, NIV says the wild animals. They weren't wild animals. They were tame. And it says the water's receded. That's not technically correct. They actually assuaged it, dropped down. If we filled this room 4 feet deep in water, and then all of a sudden the floor caved in over here and dropped down 10 feet, that's going to suck all the water from there into the hole. That's what happened in Winter Garden, Florida, where the neighborhood fell in. Anybody see that? All of a sudden, about 4 houses and everything just dropped down about 30 feet. Boof. Big sinkhole developed. I think it's Winter Garden, just somewhere near Orlando. That happens occasionally around the world. Things just sink down. Well, during the flood, you'd get this sinking process as the ocean floors would drop out and the water would rush into those holes. The Bible says the water stood above the mountains. So I think during the first few months of the flood, the animals sorted out and fossils were forming. During the last part of the flood, the plates of the earth are still shifting and they're unstable, and they began to lift up or sink down different places. Thin spots sink down, other places lift up, forming mountain ranges. Water rushes off, forming erosion in a hurry. The Bible says in Psalm 104, at thy rebuke, they fled. At the voice of thy thunder, they hasted away, talking about the water. It says they go up by the mountains, they go down by the valleys. Now, many reference Bibles have a footnote right here, because this is an Old English phrase. What this is saying is the mountains arose, the valleys sank down. During the last part of the flood, the mountains actually lifted up. So, was Mount Everest underwater? Mount Everest wasn't there. It formed during the last part of the flood, as the mountains lifted up. So that area was underwater. That's how you explain the clams on top, but Mount Everest technically wasn't there until after the flood, or during the flood it formed. The ocean crust is thinner than continental crust. They know this from earthquakes, you know, checking the S&P waves with kind of like doing a sonogram of the earth. They do that all the time. Thinner spots would tend to sink down. Water's going to rush in, filling in these places, causing oceans. The crust of the earth is about 30 miles thick under the continents and about 3 miles thick, 3 to 5 miles thick under the oceans. And the earth all busted up into plates like that. And some are still moving. This map shows the earthquake potential of different areas. Pensacola has just about 0 chance of getting an earthquake. Now we have a chance of getting other problems, you know, like natural disasters, like maybe, you know, hurricanes or tornadoes or politicians. But those, not much chance of an earthquake here. I think the earth crust compared to the earth is pretty thin. 30 miles compared to 8,000 is almost nothing. Kind of like a waterbed, you know. If you push down one place, someplace else lifts up. So as the earth settled out after the flood, you would get continents forming. Mountains arose, valleys sank down, water rushed